This is a Pasco Media production. Please visit pascomedia.com.
In Latin, Renovo means to renew, restore, or revive. This is the show where we explore the miraculous nature of the mundane as we look at one part of the Catholic tradition to help you engage more fully in the practice of faith. Past episodes are available at renovopodcast.com. I'm Doug Tuke, and today we're going to tackle a topic that was suggested by some great listeners. That is monks in the desert. Where did these desert fathers come from, and why is it important? And if you have any interest at all in modern monasticism, those crazy Dominicans, Franciscans, Benedictines, and so on and so forth, and such, their roots are found in this topic specifically. It's kind of an amazing story about the Catholic Church. There are some incredible things that happened way back when, and I'll tell you what, when you dig into some of these readings, the wisdom and the truth and the teaching will blow your mind, okay? The Desert Fathers, along with the Desert Mothers, of course, were hermits. Okay, they were ascetics, they were monks, and they lived mainly in the deserts of Egypt, actually the Cetes Desert, S-C-E-T-E-S desert specifically, around the 3rd century AD. So there's actually a collection of all their writings. It's called the Apophthegmata Patrum, or we just call it the Sayings of the Desert Fathers. And you can actually find that almost anywhere because that wisdom is really, really influential on the order of modern monasticism. So the most well-known of these guys was Anthony the Great, who moved to the desert in 270, 271 AD. And he basically became known as like the father and the founder of desert monasticism. But by the time he died in 356 AD, thousands of monks and nuns had been drawn into the desert following his example. And the guy who wrote the biography on Anthony, his name is Athanasius of Alexandria. He wrote, quote, "The desert had become a city." Okay. So the Desert Fathers had this huge influence on the development of modern Christianity. It's kind of funny. So many people came to them for spiritual guidance and instruction that within like 50 years, eyewitness accounts reported that the population of the desert actually equaled that of the towns. Just stew on that for a minute. That means there was so much desire to go out into the silence of the desert. So some of these pilgrims actually stayed, and this kind of became the beginnings of community. Now, the Desert Fathers, again, would leave, and they would seek solitude, and they would withdraw from the new communities, but the cycle would just repeat itself, and it resulted in a lot of communities springing up all over, faith-based communities. A lot of what was taught in the form of these kind of pithy sayings is what we find in the spirituality of the Desert Fathers today. Now, what's tough about this show is it's really, really difficult to fathom today why the Desert Fathers did what they did, or why the church, East and West, was so taken by their example for this kind of new millennium of Christianity. Okay, so it requires a lot of research and a lot of imagination to see what they were getting out of this ascetic discipline. And there's a guy, Dr. Belden Lane, who's a professor of theology at St. Louis University. He has done an unbelievable amount of research here, and I'm going to use his kind of line of questions to really seek out these answers. So he does this great research, and then he kind of asks the obvious questions about the desert monks, and then he kind of gives us these good, hearty answers. So his first question is, why did the Desert Fathers choose to work out their spirituality in the desert? Great question. So the answer would be, they sought God, first of all, and all that they knew that God was most easily was found in a place without any distractions. Okay, that was the real fodder for going. Second, the desert was also like a marvelous like lab, okay, for dealing with the self. And that is at the heart of most of the Desert Fathers and Desert Sisters teaching. This is their major spiritual project, was to work on self. How do you handle the ego and anxiousness and its constant need for support? You walk out into the desert, which doesn't care one bit about who you are or what you bring to it. And that kind of terrain offers this marvelous like antidote to the problem of the ego, the false self, which is still spoken about, I should say, extensively by many, many, many of our great spiritual thinkers today. So in the Bible and this kind of Greco-Roman culture, the deserts, it's not really like a place of spiritual growth, but it's actually a place of evil and temptation. So we have to ask the question, did the monks believe that? Did they believe that this would be a place of evil and temptation? And the answer that's found in Dr. Lay's research is that they did. And that's actually another reason that they went into the wilderness. They found precedents in the life of John the Baptist. You will not find a desert monastery without an icon of John the Baptist. He is like the patron of all the desert monasteries, okay? And especially in Jesus. So throughout his life, Christ withdrew into the desert to pray, and he began his ministry in the wilderness, being tempted for 40 days. So likewise, Antony of the desert, he starts his ministry by going into the desert to empty himself and face temptation there. So the desert for Anthony is really, it's a place where you expect temptations of hunger, of power, of beauty, of the things that the desert lacks are the things you find yourself most wanting desperately. If you look at any art of Anthony in the desert, you will almost always see this barrage of temptation and being attacked spiritually. It's amazing. The monks looked on demons and temptation as kind of aids in their spiritual lives, but they weren't overwhelmed by trials and temptations. Instead, they found God in the midst of the temptation and struggle. They knew that temptation was going to be there. So today, a lot of people go into the wilderness to kind of get back to nature, right? To kind of return to their roots. We should ask the question, was that part of the monks' motivation in the first place? And the answer is really kind of no. That wasn't really on the minds of the ancients. It's super easy for us to kind of romanticize their motivation, but Abba Macarius in Egypt was said to be this kind of lover of the desert. But this was only after spending years and years and years there. So we shouldn't really romanticize the desire to go out there. The monks, for them, the desert was primarily a training ground. Just think about that. It was like, it was boot camp. It was spiritual boot camp for many of the monks, okay? So how did the desert shape their spiritual lives? Okay, so how did it happen? So this is where we get into some meat, and I love this about this specific spirituality. The desert really kind of asks two major questions. What do you learn to ignore, and what do you learn to love? In other words, how do you let go, and what do you hold on to? Great spiritual questions for us today, right? So those are basic dimensions of the spiritual journey that the desert monks went through as they embraced the desert. So let's paraphrase kind of a cool story that's in the sayings of the Desert Fathers, and this is kind of a story that has Abba Macarius, who's a famous Egyptian monk. That's kind of in the middle of it. Here it is: a young man, a spiritual groupie of sorts. He comes to the desert west of the Nile, and he seeks out the great monk Abba Macarius. Okay, and he asks him, "How do I get to be a holy man? I want to be a holy man, and I want to be one tomorrow." Okay, all right. The monk Macarius, he smiles and he says, "Spend the day tomorrow over at the cemetery. I want you to abuse the dead for all they're worth. Throw sticks and stones at them, curse at them, call them names, anything you can think of, okay? Spend the whole day doing nothing but that, okay?" Weird. The young man, he probably thought the great monk was nuts, but he spent the day doing everything he was told, okay? So when he comes back, he sees Abba Macarius, and he asks him, Abba Macarius asked him, "What did the dead people say out there today?" And the young man responds that they didn't say a thing. They were dead. Macarius says, "Isn't that interesting? I want you to go back tomorrow and this time spend the day saying everything nice about these people. Call them righteous men and women, compliment them, say everything wonderful you can imagine." So the young guy goes back the next day. He did as he was told, and he returns to Macarius. And the monk asked him what the dead people said this time. "Well, they didn't answer a word again," replies the young man. "Ah, they must indeed be holy people," said Macarius. "You insulted them, and they did not reply. You praised them, and they did not speak. Go and do likewise, my friend, taking no account of either the scorn of men and women or their praises, and you too will be a holy man." Dude, right? That's a great story. Be dead unto self, right? We've heard that before. Okay? It's a wonderful story, right? It asks two really important questions, okay? What do you ignore, And the answer is the scorn and the praise of others, the scorn and the praise. And then the other question is more kind of indirect. What do you love? That's basically saying, since you're not going to be motivated by what others think, what are you going to give yourself to fully? That is a brilliant illustration of the heart of this desert monasticism. Okay. So I think the onlooker would probably say, how do you learn to be holy, or how is it possible to learn to love, right? The mission of who we are as disciples when you're living in solitary, like basically your self-sustained solitary confinement. That's a great question. So the monks, you have to understand, they learned that the desert teaches you how to live apart from others, how to live without compulsively needing them to give you worth or to make you feel love. So in the desert, Dr. Lane says, you learn how to live with yourself. Oh, friends, I don't care where you're coming from, urban, suburban, or rural. That's good for you to learn right now, okay? Only then, Dr. Lane says, are you capable of giving love, sacrificial love that accepts or needs nothing in return. Here's an example from our lives, okay? Because even when we live in the city, right, we can have this type of like desert experience. There's a point when you realize you have to let go of what you love most if you ever hope to really keep it, right? And only when you reach that point, like in your career or your marriage or your deepest relationship with others, when you move beyond this compulsive need for them, all right? Only then is it going to be possible really to love for the first time. It's incredibly painful letting go. But listen, once you do that, there's an incredible sense of the desert. And as Isaiah says, blossoming like a rose. So suddenly in this place of abandonment, in the place where you let go of everything you knew, you realize that when you could not hold, God gives back. He gives back, and love is born there in the very place where you had lost everything. It's freely given and then exponentially returned, okay? That's what the monks learned. The desert doesn't make any promises, not a single one. If you're going out there to suddenly become some deeply loving person, if like the young guy, you want to become holy tomorrow, there's no guarantees. That's the spiritual life, right? It's only at this risk of letting go, of ignoring self, and then all the distractions of the world, that love and compassion might occur. But as a lot of the mystics, East and West, have discovered, the experience of emptiness engenders compassion. Let me say that again. The experience of emptiness engenders compassion. All right. Dr. Lane, he asked this question. He says, in a lot of the Desert Fathers stories, it feels as if the monks practiced ascetic disciplines to earn salvation. And that's dangerous. That's dangerous. There's no merit badge system for earning salvation. That's not real. That's not what happens. So you can interpret their life out in the desert in that way. It's a pretty surface level, but there is a living out of what Meister Eckhart, he said, the spiritual life isn't so much a matter of addition as subtraction. That's a much better way to describe the monastic fathers, the trimming away of distraction, not the beating on oneself to earn salvation. So we talk about justification by faith versus works, and we often act as if like this is the key to the spiritual life. It's adding all these active virtues, doing great things for God, sharing the gospel with others and the like. Meister Eckhart said, no, it's a matter of subtraction. How much can you let go of? It's not a matter of kind of being anxious and having to prove yourself to teachers or bosses, your parents, or to God. It's to finally make yourself basically just acceptable, okay? It's a matter of letting go of all those compulsive needs to approve and recognizing that only after you abandon those compulsions, you'll be able to accept God utterly free, His grace utterly free that comes in the gospel in Jesus Christ. That's a much deeper, better understanding of what their solitary did, of what their acts in the desert did. The desert's it's a perfect place to let go of the need for recognition. Dr. Lane says, I love the image of the canyon cliff that St. Gregory of Nyssa used back in the 4th century, being on top of that cliff in a place of beauty and uneasiness. That's where you discover the majesty, the greatness, and the glory of God. You look at that canyon cliff and you think about it being there thousands, maybe even millions of years, and you ask yourself, how did that canyon cliff change on the day of my personal world fell apart, on the day of my worst stressful example? Think about it this way. Something horrible, tragic happens in our lives. We lose our loved one. Our father is tragically killed when we're young. The world has fallen apart. The Desert Father asked that question, what did the canyon cliff do that day? Or how did it change on the day of maybe a divorce, or the day you admitted your dependence on alcohol, or the day you finally shared some kind of hidden shame with someone, and you find yourself sitting there watching that canyon wall that didn't change at all. And in the midst of kind of this idea of your world falling apart, something didn't change. It was waiting. It was staying there as if for you. And in that same way, God does not change. That stone cliff, this kind of metaphor for God that Gregory of Nyssa gives us, and it invites you to pour out all this grief and anguish that you can muster and then accept it all without rebuke. Receives it all right there in the desert, and that was a unique experience in that unbelievable retreat. Something amazing is happening out in the desert. These desert fathers are teaching us this. When you become silent enough and empty enough, pouring out all your needs to God in this desert place, you're able, sometimes for the first time, to hear what you had never heard before, and that's a single word whispered by Jesus, and it's love. It's one of those words that you can't hear until you are utterly silent and utterly empty. That's a great line, right? So Dr. Lane, he says, speaking about what the most devout desert monks had experienced, John Climacus wrote, "Lucky the man who longs for God as a smitten lover does for his beloved." For me, that's what attracted and really held the monks in the desert. And it's why it still attracts a lot of souls today. That is great spiritual advice for us. It's about emptiness. It's not about merit badges. You can see, and this is so gorgeous, you can see where the origins of healthy Christian community living began with this notion of powerful spiritual surrender that Anthony and Gregory, Marcation, all these guys, that they brought this unbelievable, passionate giftedness to the table that simply laid the groundwork for what it meant to be fully devoted to Christ and Christ's presence. That is unbelievable. And that's something for us to look up to even today. Dr. Belton Lane has a quote. He says, "The desert is a perfect place to let go of the need for recognition." I got to tell you, in my world, in my little microcosmos of youth ministry, of working in diocesan ministry, parish ministry, of consulting with different publishers and organizations, I'll tell you what, that is probably the greatest prayer, is entering into spiritual deserts and the gift of letting go completely and what it means to not need recognition. And you can bet that step towards holiness will be engaged by a lot of temptation. I'm so thankful for what the Desert Fathers have given us regarding that fight. Wow, good stuff, right? Get out there, find some spiritual sayings of the desert monks. I'm telling you, there's so much out there for you to learn and to grow personally. And I don't care what your reality is. It could be urban, suburban, rural. I don't care. We have these deserts in our lives, but those have gone before us. Saints have gone before us, and they've navigated this deep investment into spirituality. Awesome. Don't forget to visit renovopodcast.com for past episodes. Please subscribe to, review, and rate our podcast. We always appreciate your input. Your topic suggestions, questions, and or comments are always welcome at doug@renovopodcast.com. Learn more about me at dougtooke.com or on Twitter and Instagram at DTOOKE and the number 1. Friends, always remember to engage the tradition, a tradition of marching into the desert, right? And live the conversion. Until next time, God bless.